I am the Maven of the Eventide, and welcome to Vampire Reviews, partner. Yes, I am aware that it is a fedora, but it was the closest thing I had to a cowboy hat. Filmmaker John Carpenter is known as one of the greatest masters of the horror genre. Now. He's known that way now. Most famous as the director of Halloween and other classics like The Thing and The Fog. It hasn't exactly been a smooth road for him since he began his film career 50 years ago. With far more flops to his credit than wins, most of his fame and glory didn't come from box office success or critical acclaim, but from cult followings that popped up after his films came out on video. In fact, he was in such a slump by the end of the 90s with no financially successful films in like a decade that he was ready to throw in the towel and officially retire. But what pulled him back from the brink? A vampire film. Based on the 1990 novel by John Steakley called Vampires, with a $sign for the S, because I don't know, reasons. It's about vampire slayers working for the Vatican, so I guess they get paid, unlike vampire slayers who do the job out of the goodness of their heart, but the money really has nothing to do with the story. The film Vampires, no $sign, because really, it means nothing, had been optioned by Largo Entertainment and tossed around a few years and a few directors at the studio before it ended up in John Carpenter's lap. He saw enough potential in the script and the source material to be like, you know what? I'm not going to retire after all. I'm going to make a vampire movie. Besides, it wasn't just a horror film, but also a Western. And he'd always wanted to make a Western. He's actually even said,
"When I started out to be a filmmaker, it was with the intention of directing Westerns. Halloween changed all that for me. Its unprecedented success turned me into a thriller director."
But finally, a Western. And this was important because he didn't want his vampire film to be like those other vampires. Ugh. This was the second half of the 90s when Buffy the Vampire Slayer was in its heyday, and somehow the vampire had become a heartthrob. John Carpenter wasn't here for that.
The vampire movie started out as a gothic romance. Bram Stoker's Dracula is about a tragic figure who contemplates his perverted immortality.
Is it? Have you actually read the book? Anyway.
Bela Lugosi terrified audiences in the 1930s, but today his vampire has become a friendly uncle. And worse still, we have cute little Buffy and her fanged friends in our living rooms each week.
Worse? I challenge your definition of worse, but go on.
My vampires are savage creatures. There isn't a second of brooding loneliness in their existence. They're too busy ripping and tearing humans apart. They'd have torn Buffy's liver out before she knew what happened.
Because she's not a fully competent vampire slayer, in a way far more competent than most of the vampire slayers in this movie. That's what we're going in for here. Violent, heartless, savage monsters without a scrap of feeling. And with a budget of $60 million, Carpenter was ready to make a film so full of graphic violence to push the censors to the limits. Except at the very last minute, the budget was slashed to $20 million, only a third of the original, and they had to completely change the script to get the thing done on a shoestring. But probably for the best, because when it finally came out in 1998, that's just about what it made at the domestic box office, and John Carpenter barely squeaked by with at least one financially successful film of the decade. But even though it did far better than so many of his flops, you won't find this film near the top of anyone's favorites list when it comes to rankings of Carpenter's catalog. Of the 20 films he's made, many people even consider it one of his worst. You see, Carpenter is known as one of the greats of horror cinema because most of his films use the language of genre to address deep philosophical questions, like What is the nature of evil, and how do we respond to it without becoming evil ourselves? How do we use politics or spirituality to structure our society without letting them corrupt us? What is the balance between individuality and conformist culture that keeps us from tipping into anarchy or consumerism at the expense of the working class? And as we know, and love to discuss here on Vampire Reviews, the vampire is exceptionally fertile territory for social and political metaphor because the vampire is the most human of all monsters. Except for when you strip all the humanity out of the vampires and make them too busy ripping and tearing humans apart to have any personality or complexity whatsoever. By taking this approach to the vampire, the film was already setting itself up for difficulty in delivering any kind of thematic message, intentional or inadvertent. But it's not like we don't have plenty of other vampire media with inhuman monsters that still has something interesting or relevant to say as art. It's often in how these monsters are contrasted with their human opponents, the complexities of human nature we see when placed in opposition to such a ruthless, soulless foe. The film follows a team of vampire slayers funded by the Catholic Church. Their job is to wipe out vampire nests in the Wild Wild West, which usually consist of a master vampire and their vampire goons. So, with this opposing slayer dynamic, here's our opportunity to see some character depth and some of that classic social reflection Carpenter usually provides in his films. It's too bad he didn't do that this time. Nope. Carpenter said,
For me, it was essential that the vampire slayer be as savage as the prey he's after.
And to this end, he cast James Woods, playing one of the most unlikable characters he's ever played, Jack Crow.
James Woods is the kind of guy you'd believe could and would chew off the leg of a vampire.
And the scenery, while he's at it. Carpenter says he managed to get along just fine with the notoriously difficult to work with James Woods by letting him improvise a version of every single scene, just go completely off the rails however he wanted. And the movie ended up using a lot of those takes in the final cut.
Can I ask you something? Yep. I was kicking your ass back there. Did that give you wood? What? Huh? You get a little mahogany from that little ebony? Come on, tell the truth.
Hero, ladies and gentlemen.
Have you ever seen a vampire? They're not romantic, all right? It's not like they're a bunch of fucking fags hopping around in rented formal wear and seducing everybody in sight with cheesy Eurotrash accent. Forget whatever you've seen in the movies. They don't turn into bats. They don't sleep in coffins lined in taffeta. Garlic? You wanna try garlic? You stand there with garlic around your neck. One of these buggers will bend you fucking over and take a walk up your strata chocolata while he's sucking the blood out of your neck.
Yeah, I guess this film really had to make the vampires so shallow and irredeemingly meaningless in order to make James Woods seem in any way like a person you would want to root for in comparison. As Jack Crow, he's several steps beyond your cliche super macho tough guy badmouth anti-hero action man. He's just utterly grotesquely unsavory with no depth. All we know about him is that he was raised by the Catholic Church to be a vampire-killing machine with no life outside his job. His only redeeming quality is his competence and devotion to his cause, but he's an asshole to everyone he meets. So this film's message is making a point about savagery. And that point is, it exists on both sides. We live in a society, I guess. It's definitely one of the most shallow of Carpenter's films, but if you like gratuitous violence and gore, it pushes the limit. They even had to cut out a few scenes just to keep it rated R and not fall into the NC-17 category. TV Tropes rates it M for manly, where even the nerdy priest character gets to be an action hero by the end, and the only female characters are scantily clad sex workers. The story follows Jack Crow's team of roughneck slayers as they clean out a vampire nest. All goes well except for the mysterious fact that the nest's master vampire wasn't home, which means he's still out there somewhere, and probably pretty pissed. But they still celebrate a job well done with a party full of hookers and booze. Until the master vampire shows up and kills them all. These are supposed to be pros? What were they thinking? And he's not just any master vampire. This is Jan Valak, the very first vampire to ever exist. We find out that he used to be a Catholic priest back in the 1300s, but he decided Catholicism was bad actually and tried to lead a peasant revolt against the church. The church captured him and decided he must be possessed by demons, because why else would anyone ever think organized religion might not be the best thing in the world? So they tried to do this reverse exorcism on him, but it ended up getting botched and the ritual wasn't completed, and it turned him into the world's first vampire. Oopsie. And now Valak wants to complete the ritual, because once it's done, he'll still be a vampire. That was always going to happen, apparently. But he'll also be able to walk in the sunlight, as sunlight is one of the only things that actually kills vampires in this universe, and their lives seem pretty horrible, being constantly hated and hunted. Yeah, sure, I get that. Now, if this plot sounds familiar to you at all, yes, it is the exact same thing the vampires were trying to do in the movie Blade, which had just come out 2 months before this movie and was a much more successful film. Ooh, bad timing. But unlike the vampires in Blade, who have very distinct personalities and a complex social structure with plans and schemes and hopes and dreams, we don't ever know why these vampires want to be able to walk in the sunlight other than that it will help them not die. No talk of world domination or anything. They've never been ambitious.
Why doesn't anyone know?
Nobody wants to know. That's how vampires survive. They're smart. They keep their numbers low, live in small bands, and the real world never catches on.
But Jack Crow isn't going to let that happen. No, sir. His boss at the church, Cardinal Alba, gives him a new priest sidekick, and he's still got one Slayer buddy left. And since Valak bit one of the sex workers at the party, she now has a psychic link to him, and they can use her to track him down. While tying her up naked and smacking her around, of course, as you do. And of course she ends up falling in love with this guy. But what does this ragtag team find? They were set up by Cardinal Alba. He's getting old and doesn't want to die, so he's helping Valak in exchange for becoming a vampire himself. Okay, so here's the thing. When you have vampire lore that's directly linked to Christianity, we're operating under the assumption that God is real, which this film acknowledges.
Nobody believes in vampires.
See, the thing is, we know vampires are stalking the earth. We also know there's a God, too.
We just don't understand him.
Valak is the original, the source of the disease, the first vampire created by the Catholic Church.
By accident.
The power of God created this vampire, so God must exist. All these characters know this. But then, the evil, completely not at all predictable twist villain, Cardinal Alba, does some classic monologuing and says this.
As one grows old, as death approaches, we begin to question our faith. Is there a God? Is there a heaven? I can no longer answer this for certain. I have witnessed no miracles, had no visions, and the prospect of death terrifies me. I realized I have only one alternative, and I made a bargain with the devil, if you wish.
Witness no miracles? What about the fact that freaking vampires exist as created by one of your very own magical Catholic rituals? Your motivation makes no sense, sir. Just admit that you think vampires are badass and you want to be one, and you were never a good Christian to start with. So, yeah. Surprise! The corrupt and self-serving Catholic Church was the real evil all along. Never seen that one before.
So if he completes the ritual, I think the balance shifts. A master vampire, able to walk in the sun, unstoppable.
But what would he do in the sun? Take down the Catholic Church? Would that be so bad in this case? The church created the evil that is the vampire in the first place, and then spends all this money and resources waging this war against them, building up this entire ideology about fighting an enemy that never would have existed without them to begin with as a way to keep control over the common man, making this big show of trying to stamp the evil out, while actually corruptly enabling it all to their own advantage. Religion is a scam. In the end, all anyone wants is immortality. Even though the vampires here are shown as being fully capable of complex thought and conversation, they can't be allowed to be perceived as having any personality or character because they're just pawns of a greater evil. The church needs to dehumanize the tools it uses to wield its power. And Valak's only crime to begin with was that he turned against this corrupt organization and tried to revolt. He probably wanted to, make the world a better place or something. And the church just ended up making a savage demonic monster out of him, which required humans to be just as savage in order to hunt this monster.
Time to slay some vampires, Padre. You up for it?
I guess so.
And in the end, even after being disillusioned about the origins of his entire life's purpose, Jack Crow still kills the vampires and continues to pursue his cause, because he will always serve the system that created him. He knows no other way. He has neither grown nor changed as a character, nor has he made his world a better place. At the end of the film, he and his world are exactly the same as they began. Compare this ending to something like one of John Carpenter's great films, like Escape from New York, where the super gritty macho anti-hero makes a final decision that changes the entire course of global society when he is faced with a confirmation of the faults of his government. Yeah, Snake, stick it to the man with your philosophical ideals. Jack Crow over here with his vampires, uphold the status quo. And God, still his co-pilot.
Just the two of us.
No, Mr. Crow. He was always with us.
Fair enough, Padre.
And we know nothing changes in this universe because this movie had 2 direct-to-video sequels. And the vampires and slayers just keep going on, doing their thing ad infinitum. John Carpenter was producer in name only of the first sequel, Vampires Los Muertos, another Western, starring John Bon Jovi as the grumpy slayer this time. And Carpenter was not at all involved with the third one, which changed genres to be a Thailand-based martial arts film. And they're pretty bad. They make the first movie look downright charming by comparison. At least, compared to John Bon Jovi, James Woods actually has a character at all, even if that character is a despicably unlikable asshole. But that was the point. When asked what went into his choices for this film, John Carpenter said,
I wanted to make an edgier film than some of the ones I had been doing a few years earlier, so I really let the actors loose.
Edgier. Yeah. 'Cause it was the end of the 90s, and everything had to be edgy. I wish you'd just stuck to what you're so good at. I'm the Maven of the Eventide, and the vampires didn't deserve this. I was actually going to talk a lot more about Vampires Los Muertos, but we're going to have to save that conversation for another night. It's actually the entire reason why I finally addressed this franchise in the first place. Because one of you sent Vampires Los Muertos to me because you really, really wanted me to watch it. Thank you. If any of you would like to request me to review a vampire movie or TV show or anime or book or anything with vampires in it, you can do that on my Patreon. You can also just support me there and help me make more videos like this one. My patrons always get to watch my videos first, exclusively, before anyone else does. Private vampires, just for you. Think about it.